just to calibrate, who all has been to one of the other conferences that Dolph mentioned in Salzal or Lecce? Just show of hands, quickly. So not that many. We have quite a few new people here. That's really good to hear. Is there a laser pointer on here somewhere? Don't touch that. Okay. Never mind. I'll. I can use the mouse. Anyway, so I have a few minutes this morning just to talk about ecosystem services in science, and of course you're all wondering what that means. And this is an interesting graph that I found. That's a visualization of sustainability science from a recent paper. And it's based on a citation analysis, but you can see that it's quite a complex set of interconnections of all of the things that are related to this issue of sustainability. You can see that ecological economics is a, do I have a pointer here? All right, that one, yeah. Ecological economics is a very central place, but it covers very many different topics in a very integrated, highly interconnected kind of way. And I think ecosystem services likewise covers most of these areas of science. So what we're trying to do, I think, in this field is to tie all these pieces together to be much more integrated in our approach. There's probably no one in this room who hasn't seen this diagram before. I'm thinking from the Millennium Assessment. So I think we all know the basic idea behind ecosystem services, the benefits that people derive from ecosystems. Those benefits are quite large in number, and their connections between the functioning systems and the human benefits, I think, are also quite complex. And so I think the science here is really building our understanding of what those interconnections look like and how they might change as we change things in the system. So, and I won't go through the list of services, which I'm sure you've already seen, but just to recognize that on the other side, there's a whole range of human benefits that are much larger than just the sort of conventional ideas of economic consumption. So security and health and the social relations. So tying all this together, I think, is what our challenge is. We also have to recognize that it's becoming more and more evident that we live on a finite planet, that there are certain boundaries that we have to respect. So this is from a recent paper, or a couple of papers, that tried to identify what those planetary boundaries were, and we identified nine different variables, and you can see that climate change, biodiversity loss, and the nitrogen cycle are already far outside what we defined as the safe operating space for humanity in this system. So I think that's another part of the challenge, that our boundaries are being pushed, that our ecosystem services are being threatened, and if we hope to maintain a viable, sustainable, and desirable presence on the planet, we had better acknowledge these facts and begin to design institutions that can keep us within those planetary boundaries. So, in order to do that, I think we need to develop a whole new vision of what the economy is and what it's for, and to recognize that we are living in this full world situation, and that we have to recognize that we live in a materially closed system, and most importantly, I think we have to recognize the relationships between our natural capital assets, our ecosystem, and the services that they provide, and how they affect human well-being in combination with our other assets, our human, our social, and our built capital assets. So to understand ecosystem services, I think you have to understand this whole system. It's not just about understanding the ecology. It's not just about understanding society or the economy. It's about understanding the whole system and how it's interconnected. So in that sense, it's a very much of a bridge concept. Ecosystem services are the links, or one of the links, between our natural capital assets and human well-being. And we also have to understand that human well-being is a much more complex function than certainly the conventional economic ideas would lead you to believe. It's about consumption of goods and services, but it's more about relative consumption than absolute consumption, and it's about the contribution of all of these other factors that may or may not influence the conventional market. They may directly influence human well-being. So interest, as Dolph said, in this area of ecosystem services has been increasing rapidly, and you saw the graph and everything, and he mentioned the TEEB study, and there's several other U.S. agencies that have gotten very interested in this area. So interest is increasing rapidly, and probably most importantly, the development of this ecosystem services partnership. And what we're trying to do with this partnership is to really coordinate all of this activity and try to build some cooperation around it, and build a critical mass, which I think can then have much more influence on how things work. These partnerships, I think, are evolving not only at the global scale, but at other scales. There's a national partnership in the U.S., and we're working on developing a Cascadia partnership for this part of the Pacific Northwest in the U.S. So regional, national groups, I think, are developing as well. Let's go back to just listing some basic facts about ecosystem services and natural capital that I think there's broad agreement on, and this comes from the last conference that we had in Salzal, where we developed this message, as we were calling it, that listed some of the basic facts and also some of the research agenda, which I'll get to at the end. So just to reiterate, ecosystem services are the contributions of ecosystems in combination with these other inputs to human well-being. I think we just need to emphasize that a bit, that you have to think of this in a more integrated way, and how ecosystems contribute in combination with human-built and social capital. They represent a significant contribution to well-being. And this is being increasingly recognized. They are being threatened and degraded. We have to stay within these planetary boundaries, particularly the climate change and biodiversity loss issues are beginning to affect ecosystem services. This approach, I think, helps us to identify and quantify these trade-offs and synergies on which decision-making must be based. So the whole issue of valuation of ecosystem services, I think, is structured around this idea of trade-offs. What exactly are we giving up, and in terms of contributions to human well-being? I think there's a lot of research still required to sort of better evaluate these kinds of trade-offs. And finally, that many, if not most, ecosystem services are public goods or common pool resources. So they should not be privately owned, and we need to develop new kinds of institutions, I think. The market works well for private goods, things that are rival and excludable. It doesn't work so well for goods that are not rival and not excludable. So what are some different kinds of institutions that use economic incentives but are not necessarily based on the private goods kind of exchanges? Dolph already showed one sort of diagram, but I think this is a diagram we're working on how to better describe networks and their interconnections. This is based on this co-authorship of people who have written papers on ecosystem services, and how that network is interconnected through co-authorships and through other kinds of relationships. And you get some interesting kinds of clusters, arising when you start looking at these kinds of networks. So I think understanding the social capital of groups like this, of this ecosystem services partnership itself, is one of the things that we can look at, and how to build these kinds of networks into more active, more resilient kinds of things. And Dolph already mentioned this, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, just another indication of growing interest in this area. We've also formed recently a joint U.S.-China Center on Ecosystem Services, so interest in China is also exploding, and I think there are many opportunities to work there and in many other places around around the world. Even the World Bank, has expressed some interest recently in ecosystem services, as this quote from Robert Zolnick implies. I've been talking with the woman who's leading this effort, and they're not working on it quite as hard as I would have liked, but shocking. But at least they're saying some of the right words, and I think they're sort of headed in that direction. At Portland State, we recently got a grant from NSF for an IGERT program that will fund 25 PhD students to work on this issue of ecosystem services. So things are happening. Okay, and Dolph did mention this paper, and I should point out that in addition to all these other people, there's this guy here from the Netherlands who was part of this study as well. And the idea here was to just take a first stab at trying to put together what's the relative magnitude of these ecosystem services compared to other contributions to human well-being, and our conclusions were they were really pretty big. We don't want to put too much emphasis on the exact numbers other than the order of magnitude. I think one of the problems was that Nature, when they printed this article, and they control the cover and what goes on the cover, and they titled it "Pricing the Planet," and we really were not doing that. We were really trying to value the planet, as Dolph pointed out. So I think that maybe led to some misperceptions about what we were actually trying to do. And as I said, most ecosystem services are public goods or common pool resources. So we're not trying to trade them in markets, but we are trying to value them as public goods and use that information to help within these other kinds of institutions that that we may need, I think, to better manage these resources. So valuing and commodifying are not the same thing. This didn't quite all come out properly, did it? Okay. This was the Mac to PC conversion. Anyway, this was supposed to be a list of the problems that we identified in the Nature paper, and this was actually the largest section of the paper. If you go back and read it, it was about the problems and caveats. And our conclusions were that solving these problems would probably just lead to larger numbers. So we were doing very much of an underestimate. But it also serves, I think, as a sort of research agenda. If you're trying to do a better job of quantifying the value of ecosystem services, these are some of the things that you would need to solve. First of all, we had incomplete studies. Not all biomes were well studied, and some not at all. That's been changing over the last decade and a half. So we've done a lot more research now. We can deal with many of these other problems as well. Most of the studies we use were based on willingness to pay or some kind of proxies. There are many other ways, I think, to get at the value of ecosystem services, and I think that's an issue for much additional research. How do we actually understand and identify the benefits, some of which may be perceived by people, some of which people may be willing or able to pay for, but many of which are not perceived very well, or they're not willing or able to pay for. Maybe that's the wrong way to look at it, but they still have this connection with well-being and benefits that we should be able to model, understand, and quantify. And you can go down the rest of the list. Certainly there are discontinuities in these functions that we need to identify. There are tipping points and things like that. We assumed that these services were homogeneous across biomes. We just said, a wetland has a certain range of values, and here's the average value. Obviously that's not the case, and things are spatially heterogeneous. How do we better map those things? We need to use a more general equilibrium kind of framework that looks at the whole system, not just pieces of it at a time, and at sustainable use levels, and et cetera, et cetera. Let's see. And finally, that this was a static snapshot, and we need to look more at the dynamics of these systems. So building better, more complete models, better understanding this whole issue of valuation, which has to do with really what are the trade-offs, what are the contributions of various items to achieving particular goals. And those goals extend beyond simply economic efficiency. They include fairness, they include sustainability, potentially other things. And our approaches to valuation have to take those alternative goals into account. I don't think very much work has been done yet on what do we mean by value, according to fairness, the contributions of ecosystems and natural capital to this goal of social fairness. And more directly, perhaps, is the goal of sustainability. How do ecosystem services contribute to sustainability, in addition to their contributions to meeting these other goals? So I think there's a lot of work still to be done on just understanding what we mean by value and benefits, and how we begin to model those. There's certainly many different ways to classify ecosystem services as well, and I don't think there's any one right way to do this, but there's many different ways for different purposes. And one has to do with this issue of excludability and rivalness, as I mentioned briefly, that some ecosystem services can be considered market goods. They're rival and excludable, but many, if not most of them, fit into one of these other categories that are either non-rival or non-excludable, and we need to deal with them in a different way than simply using conventional market kinds of institutions. So understanding the relationship between institutions and the kind of service that we're managing is important. Maybe Rosemary will talk about this a little bit in her discussion. We also need to recognize that these services vary in terms of their spatial characteristics. Things like carbon sequestration and climate regulation are global services. It doesn't really matter where you sequester carbon on the globe. But many of the other services depend on proximity, or they depend on the flow of water through the watershed, or they depend on where they are in situ, or they depend on the movement of users toward to get to the service. So their spatial characteristics vary, in different ways, and we can sort of categorize them and lump them in these different ways and use that to help us better understand and model these services. It's also important, I think, to aggregate these services for some purposes. So it's interesting to understand this, the value of a particular site to a particular population at a particular point in time. But we also need to be able to extrapolate from that and to say what's the aggregate value. So there are several different ways to do that. Starting with this basic value transfer idea is what we used in the Nature paper and some other studies I'll mention. Which is a good way to get started and give you at least an initial estimate, but obviously you can do better than that. But doing better is going to take more effort, more resources, etc. You can modify that by simply asking. We know that not all forests are the same, so you could survey experts and say, well, what's the variation in the quality of the forest and the kinds of services that they're producing. If you have enough data, you can actually do a statistical model that says, well, what do these values depend on in terms of their proximity to different other variables, or the type of valuation that was used, etc. And finally, I think you can do more spatially explicit, dynamic kinds of modeling of these kinds of systems. And I'll just touch on a couple of quick examples there, but I think there's a lot of opportunities for extending this research, and probably many of you are going to be talking about some of those kinds of things in the coming days. Using this basic value transfer approach, we can based on land use, map the location of or the value of ecosystem services. So based on just assuming a constant value per biome, you can do that. This is the state of New Jersey. This has been useful, I think, in some management contexts. We did a study for the state of New Jersey on the value of their natural capital assets, just based on land use and the value the average value per hectare. You can then begin to look at how that plays out in terms of the value of those ecosystem services and aggregate that up. Dave Batker and Earth Economics were involved in a couple of studies that use that basic technique, one on the value of the Mississippi River Delta, another one on the value of the Puget Sound, that again brought in this expert survey system to sort of modify the values a bit, make them more relevant to the local conditions. I was recently at a workshop in Bhutan which is taking a whole different approach to their national policies. As you probably have heard, their national policy goal is gross national happiness, not gross national product. So what do they mean by that? And they do surveys of subjective well-being, but they also recognize that their natural capital assets contribute very highly to their sense of gross national well-being or happiness. And so we were there at a workshop to try to help them to build that into their national accounting framework. And this might be one of the first countries that will take this idea seriously as a sovereign nation and build these ideas more directly into their accounting framework. And you've probably seen several examples of how you would go about quantifying the value of these ecosystem services. I'll just give you one quick example that I was involved with on the value of coastal wetlands for storm protection. This is Hurricane Katrina. We can assemble data these days on the tracks of all the storms and the area of wetlands in the swath and the infrastructure that's there to be damaged and the intensity of the storm, etc. And so you can build a statistical relationship that says the relationship between the damage and the wind speed and the wetland area, and use that to derive the avoided cost, essentially. How much more would the damages be if these wetlands were not there? And based on that, we can explain, at least in this case, about 60% of the variation in these damages from that simple relationship of wetland area and wind speed and infrastructure. And then we can use that to better map these services. So this gets us down to so this is the area of wetlands, this is the marginal value, and then you can integrate under that marginal value curve and get an estimate of the total value of wetlands for storm protection. And then you can look at the totals that represents. And so taking into account the intensity of or the probability of storms, you get values that cover quite a large range, but also have quite a large mean value, in the thousands of dollars per hectare per year, just for the storm protection value. And if you add all that up for the U.S. coast, it's about $23.2 billion a year. So this has quite significant and direct policy implications. In Louisiana, for example, they have to decide, are we going to protect the coast by building a giant levee, along the whole coast, which is going to be very expensive, is not really going to, last very long. It doesn't really produce anything else other than just a levee, this storm protection service. Or are we going to restore the coastal wetlands, which, in addition to providing storm protection, provide this broad range of other services that are also very valuable. And I think they are coming around to the conclusion that the latter approach, that using the ecosystem services and natural capital assets is going to be a better way to go. So science, where is the science going in all of this? I think ultimately we need to do, as I said at the beginning, a better job of building an integrated understanding, integrated models of humans embedded in ecological systems, this whole systems approach. There's not one right way to do this. I think it's going to require what I call intelligent pluralism. While there's not one right way, there are probably different ways that are better for different purposes. So we have to recognize that they're not all equally good. But there's certainly not one way that's always the best. And we have to think of these models in multiple scales in time and space and complexity. And I'm almost done with my time, so I think I better hurry up. They can be used as consensus building tools in this more participatory process. So how do you use the process of modeling these systems to build consensus that acknowledges uncertainty, that acknowledges the values that the stakeholders bring to this process, and that takes a more evolutionary approach that incorporates history and the fact that evolution doesn't always lead to the optimal conclusions. We need to recognize that the credibility of these models comes from at least two sources, both the sort of how well the system fits the data, but also how the degree of consensus among the stakeholders that are using this model about what's going into it. And if you can do both of those things, with more of a mediated modeling process, you're better off. So just some prior attempts to build these kinds of integrated models. This one at the global scale, and we did a few years ago. I think it was the first attempt to actually build an integrated global model that was dynamic, that actually addressed this issue of ecosystem services. And you can see it was somewhat complex, but not so complex that you couldn't run it on a PC. And it included, I think, most of the issues that we're talking about. Produces a whole bunch of output, over different periods of time, and we can play around with that and try to calibrate it against, historical data. In this case, the land use components of the system, and ultimately we can use that to produce projections of the value of ecosystem services, off into the future under different scenarios. So this is at least an attempt to get at the dynamic interactions of all of these systems, and what does that lead to. You can do this more at a landscape scale, and we've been working at that scale on some projects as well. This is a recent book that describes several case studies, including this one in the Patuxent River watershed in Maryland, that tried to get at those dynamic interactions in a spatially explicit way and look at the impacts of different policies and future scenarios on the whole range of outputs, including the value of ecosystem services. More recently, we've been trying to apply these in a multi-scale sort of framework, and I think Roel Bouwmans is here. If he's not here yet, I think he's on the schedule. There he is, back there, yeah. So he's going to talk about this MIMES system, multi-scale integrated models of ecosystem services that try to do that in a way that allows you to change the spatial resolution and produce output, from anywhere from the global scale to the watershed scale in a more consistent way. So going forward, I think we need to do more of this at Portland State. We've recently started the Center for Integrated Multi-Scale Modeling to sort of help pursue this and other kinds of applications of this approach to integrated modeling. It has a range of goals here: participatory development of the next generation of models, better ways to test model performance, better ways to store and access and assess the quality of the data, and integration across multiple platforms. And I'm going to end with what looks like a whole bunch of text here, but this is the other part of the Salzal message that came out of the last meeting. So just to set the stage maybe for this meeting, this is the consensus that we came up with about what sort of needed to be worked on. And we divided it into these two areas of integrated measurement, modeling, valuation, and decision science in support of ecosystem services, with these major subheads of understanding trade-offs, understanding accounting and assessment at multiple scales, doing a better job of integrated modeling, understanding the bundling of these services, so not looking at one service at a time, independent of everything else, but how do they interact with each other, and thinking of the whole system as producing this sort of range of services, and this issue of scaling over a broad range of scales to understand how these systems function at multiple scales up to the global scale. I should say that the Salzal message is on the website somewhere, I think. If that's not right, Sander, if you can tell me if that's true. But I haven't looked recently, but I think it's up there. So you can go on the website and look at this in more detail. The other part of it, and this is maybe what Rosemarie will be talking about in her presentation, this adaptive management and new institutions for ecosystem services. So how do we deal with this issue of property rights and the common property nature of many ecosystem services, matching the scale of the institutions to the scale of the service or the problem, the whole issue of distribution, who benefits from which ecosystem services, and how do we improve this distribution to make it more fair. How do we better disseminate information about the services? How do we enhance participation? And finally, and maybe the theme of this conference, how do we improve the science policy interface? And I think that's one thing that this ecosystem services partnership really can help us to do by including not only the scientists, but also the policymakers and others in the partnership. It's not just an academic society. This is more of a partnership across that whole range of science and practice. And I'll end by saying that we really need to discuss more, to have a venue for discussing what are the real solutions going forward to many of these problems. Ecosystem services, I think, are going to contribute to these solutions. And we've started a journal called Solutions that's devoted to that. Ida Kubashevsky here, if you raise your hand, is the managing editor, and we'll have a display of some of the issues of solutions. It's also available for free online, so take a look at that. We're trying to do something very different with this journal, make it more of a hybrid academic journal and popular magazine, so it can actually communicate with the policy community and communicate across multiple academic disciplines and help us to actually find some of the solutions that we're searching for. And I should say that our next issue, the one after this one, coming out in November, is devoted to ecosystem services. That's the theme. And several of you in the room have contributed papers to that special issue, and the rest hopefully will take a look at it. Sorry we didn't have it in time for this conference, but we also will be looking for contributions along these lines in future. So some of the things that come out of this conference you might think about publishing in Solutions, or we have another venue that I don't think Dolph mentioned in his talk, but there's a new journal that Elsevier will be coming out with in 2012 titled Ecosystem Services. So there will be a whole academic journal devoted just to this topic of ecosystem services, in addition to the other venues that are already out there, Ecological Economics and several other journals. So there are plenty of places now to publish the results of the kinds of things that we are all working on, and to keep that exponential curve that Dolph showed going up even faster in the future. So, right, right, it will level off at some point, but I think we still have a long way to go before we really need it to level off, because I think this topic is one that can really help us to solve our fundamental problem of building a more sustainable and desirable future. Thank you very much.